Rico Chapman. I'm the academic director here at COPO. I also teach in the history department, history and philosophy department here at Jackson State. We have some students here from the class Introduction to Museums slash museology. So you are here to listen to and be engaged with the museum professionals. And we also have visitors from the community and visitors from outside the state. So this is a public forum, and we welcome you to COPO, the Hammond Institute at COPO. We were founded in 1961, officially as COPO, Council of Federated Organizations. And the building went into disarray a few years later in '65, but it housed SNCC, NAACP, SELC, CORE, and multiple Mississippi civil rights organizations. So after the building went into disarray, it became a radio station and a host of other things. We have a student here, our graduate assistant, Precious Vines, who will correct me, right, Precious? She's writing her master's thesis on COPO, so she knows every detail that I don't know, which is a lot. So please correct me, Precious, if I misstate any facts. So we were renovated. Jackson State wrote a grant to renovate the building in 2009. It was fully renovated in 2011 with the grand opening in 2011. Our founding director was Daphne Chamberlain. She's now at Tougaloo. She teaches history there. She operates the Civil Rights Institute. That's not the official name, but she works in that capacity at Tougaloo. We have our interim director on camera, Mr. Keith McMillan. And we have another director, graduate assistant, Mario Musgrove. He's not with us tonight. So we're a small staff of 4. We just try to do what we can in terms of community outreach, exhibitions, and public programming. And this is one of those public programs. So today, our theme of Public History Forum, so we know museums fall under this umbrella of public history, the growth of African-American focused museums in the 21st century. So this is going to be a great discussion because we are growing in the museum field, especially African-American museums. We have a new museum coming on board in 2017 right here in Mississippi, and you'll hear from Ms. Jackie Dace about that. We have the National Museum of African-American History and Culture. It's supposed to open 2015, if I'm not mistaken. 2016? Okay. So they're building as we speak, just like the Civil Rights Museum. So there's a host of African American museums, not only in Mississippi, but throughout the nation, and we'll have that discussion tonight. So any questions you have, any issues you want to raise, now's the time to do it. So we'll discuss the growing field of museums, opportunities, fundraising, collections, controversial issues, if you like, but keep it kosher. We're gonna keep it cool, but we can agree to disagree. And also we'll talk about how Mississippi is kind of falling into, or maybe on the forefront, I think, in terms of civil rights history. I want to say forefront, because that's what we have to start positioning Mississippi to be, in terms of cultural tourism. We got to get people to the state to visit our cultural sites, our civil rights sites, because we have a lot of rich history that people don't necessarily tap into. There's some hidden gems in Mississippi. So we'll have this discussion tonight, and please feel free to voice your opinions and questions when the time is right, and I'll let you know when it is. So I'll get started with some brief intros. To my immediate left, Ms. Jacqueline Dace. She's the project manager for the new Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which will be located here in Jackson, Mississippi. She previously served for 2 years as the collections manager at the DuSable Museum in Chicago. Some of you may have visited. She's originally from St. Louis. She worked for 16 years with the Missouri Historical Society, Missouri Historical Society, and ended her career with that institution as the curator of African American history. She She has taught at Washington University in St. Louis. She has an extensive background in public exhibitions with a specific focus on African American communities and history. A selection of national organizations that DACE is affiliated with include the Oral History Association, the American Association for State and Local History, the Association of African American Museums, the National Council on Public History, and the list goes on and on. It's a long list, so I won't keep reading that list to you, but her vita is extensive. So please welcome Ms. Jacqueline Dace. Once again, back to Coco. Mr. Dion Brown, to my far left, is the Executive Director of the B.B. King Museum and Delta Interpretive Center in Indianola, Mississippi. If you haven't been to the B.B. King Museum, please, please, please go. It's a fabulous museum. I've been a couple of times, a few times, and every time I go, I see something different. So he assumed this position a few years ago in 2011. Prior to that, he was the Chief Operating Officer for Exploration Place, a science and discovery center in Wichita, Kansas. While there, he was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the museum and the $5 million budget while directing a staff of up to 71 employees. So Mr. Brown continues the vision of the museum by the numerous programs designed to fight obesity, literacy, and community unification. So he sends out monthly newsletters, and they have these fabulous programs that deal with youth, health, and all of this pumping out of the B.B. King Museum. You wouldn't think that the museum would be involved in community outreach as such, but the B.B. King Museum is doing that in the Delta. Mr. Brown has been an ambassador for the Delta and the state of Mississippi by speaking at several civic organizations across the country about the Delta and works for the Delta in any capacity he is asked, including this one. So welcome, Mr. Brown. Appreciate that. Last but not least, in the middle, Ms. Pamela Jr. She's a familiar face around town. She is the museum manager for the Smith-Robertson Museum and Cultural Center here in Jackson. I'm sure most of you have been. I know the majority of the class has been. We just visited a couple of weeks ago. It was a great visit. Ms. Jr. has worked for the museum for 14 years. Through her leadership, the museum has created a completely new facility with more emphasis on large format graphics, cutouts, and museum exhibit fabrication to start. Smith-Robertson is the only museum in Mississippi with a slave ship large enough to walk through. The only museum in the United States with a comprehensive gallery on the life and times of Medgar Wiley Evers. We remember that exhibit, it was great. So these accolades were noticed by CNN, giving the museum recognition of 50 states, 50 spots for 2014. So Ms. Jr., her work is putting Mississippi on the national map. Jackson often is seen nationally, but not in a bright light. We usually see Jackson, just an example, we usually see Jackson, they come with the cameras from the worst neighborhoods, and they don't show the Smith-Robertson, they'll show the dilapidated houses around Smith-Robertson. They'll talk about obesity, they'll talk about poverty. So Ms. Jr. is putting Jackson in a more positive light through her work at the Smith-Robertson Museum. As a young girl, Ms. Jr. read David's Son and Black Boy, never thought she would walk the same halls that he did. So of course, we know that Richard Wright attended Smith-Robertson School. She constantly reminds students that they are able to walk through the doors of any school in the state of Mississippi because of the soldiers, our forefathers who died to make all our dreams come true. She has received many awards for her work in the community, and she is the recipient of the 2014 Hometown Hero Award from the Jackson Convention and Visitors Bureau, 2013 Shiro Award for the Creative Positive Change in the Community, and the Who's Who and Black Mississippi Award in 2012. So please welcome Ms. Pamela. These are my colleagues as well as friends, and they are doing us a favor to grace the Coco Complex. So here's our format for tonight. I just introduced the panelists. So I asked them to give a brief 10 to 15 minute presentation about their work in their respective museums. Is that okay? After that, I will pose the question as the moderator, and then we'll hear from the audience. So you can begin to formulate your questions as they speak. And that's it. So we'll start with Ms. Dax. If you like, if you like.
So much. It's just wonderful.
Good evening. As Rico mentioned, I'm the project manager with the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Moved to Jackson in December of 2012. I have worked in practically every department of the museum field. Just so you know, I don't have a background in museology. My background is in the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and an interest in history that bore out of a lot of research. And that grew as I was with the Missouri Historical Society and developed several community-based projects on African Americans in St. Louis with the Missouri Historical Society. Worked in the research field, developed several oral history projects from the ground up, which is one of my favorite things to do, is to sit down and interview people about their life stories, which is a very important component of, especially when you're talking about public history, because you are able to create this new this new resource, you know, this original document from the oral history from individuals whose stories otherwise would not necessarily be told in not only the history books, but in the museum as well. So oral history is an extremely important component of developing not only exhibitions, public programming. People use them for their thesis papers, as well as dissertation and writing books. So I think as a oral historian, I'm a strong advocate for the continued use of that material. In addition to working with the research division, I also worked in publications at the Missouri Historical Society. We had a very unique institution there at the time, unique in a way because that was the way that museums were going, where they had several different departments. You have the education department, we have the interpretation department, research, publications, exhibitions, collections, and public programming, public information, and then of course you have accounting and you have administration and all of the other supplemental. We had about 135 staff members. So that was what we call the difference between a mainstream museum and in the smaller or middle museums and the smaller capacity institutions. So we were able to primarily focus on our area of expertise when I worked at that particular institution, so it was a little bit different. In the publications division, I was able to publish a 15-year index on our quarterly publication called Gateway Heritage. And the Gateway Heritage focused on stories and historical facts of the St. Louis and the expanding West. When I went to the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, served in that capacity for 2 years. I was working as the collections manager. Not only was I responsible for the same as what I would be at the Missouri Historical Society as curatorial duties, and trying to define or describe what those artifacts were, primarily the three-dimensional artifacts that were in the collections. but I was also responsible for building the collections. And in addition to that, I also developed several exhibitions while I was at the Chicago the DuSable Museum. It was actually kind of interesting because I worked on several projects that I was not necessarily an expert on, including a exhibition on the Yoruba religion and the Yoruba culture, which helped me to understand and do some research on an area that I probably otherwise would not have conducted research on. And to also connect me with a group or a community from Chicago, because they have a strong Yoruba and Nigerian, West African participant or community members in Chicago. And so we were able to develop several programs and educational components, curriculum units with the members of the Nigerian community, because they also were the ones that helped to fund the exhibition. In addition to that, I developed a project on gospel music, as it was originated out of Chicago, and its expansion throughout the rest of the world. So that was another one of those quite interesting components. The DuSable Museum itself has a particularly interesting history because it was founded by Dr. Margaret Burroughs. Dr. Margaret Burroughs and the DuSable Museum is the first African American museum in the nation that is independently owned. Okay, we have to make sure we put independently owned, because we have Hampton that is actually the first African American museum. But the DuSable Museum, along with the Wright Museum in Detroit, that was founded by Charles Wright, are sort of like our flagship institutions. And Dr. Burroughs was particularly significant in her own personal collection and building that museum, as well as founding and helped to found the Association of African American Museums, which is a professional organization of professional African American, or people that work within the focus of African American studies in the museum field. So it's a wonderful organization where we are able to get together and talk about issues that may be specific to working within an African American facility, especially as we're in competition with the larger institutions around the nation, whether we're in competition for financial support, or whether we're in competition for collections, or for building our audience. So, you know, with that being said, we're not in a, we're not isolated, and so there is some level of competition between all of us. So I worked there for 2 years before I came here to work on the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, because not only because of the, as Rico mentioned, the specific importance of the civil rights story in Mississippi, also because my mother and father are both from Mississippi, so I have a long history with Mississippi itself, but also because it is something that I wanted to grow my knowledge base in. And understanding the civil rights struggle in Mississippi, if you want to understand civil rights, you need to understand Mississippi's civil rights struggle, you know. So, I've definitely built my own personal knowledge base on the struggle of civil rights throughout the nation, by being able to understand what happened here in Mississippi and as it expanded throughout the nation. And not only in terms of the modern civil rights movement, but also in terms of what's happening today. And I was actually just talking to someone about the struggles at Ferguson, Missouri, and how, you know, it can be applied, or how some of the protesters need to be able to talk to some of the civil rights activists of the 50s and 60s to be able to understand how to actually actively and to successfully protest and not engage with the audience, because I'm not sure if you just saw one of the protests. They went to Busch Stadium, which is in St. Louis, they're in the playoffs, and there was this give and take back and forth between participants and the community. And that's part of, and I think you're saying, oh, she's going off the deep end. No, that's all part of public history, because in order for us to be able to understand contemporary issues, we need to be able to understand the historical legacy, and that's what our role is. We can take it beyond the walls of the university and make it applicable to our everyday use. And so that's what we do in the field of museology, is that we, the term now is public history, previously it was applied history. So, so it was as it directly is applied. But now we use the terminology public history, and applied history is, of course, something that's a little bit different. So in terms of what we're doing with the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, as Rico mentioned, our scheduled open date is December the 10th, 2017. We are actively collecting artifacts that represent the Mississippi struggle in the civil rights movement. We have developed our interpretive text for the museum, and we are going through each and every word of that text to check facts, to make sure that the information is not only grammatically correct, but also to make sure that the information fits into the storyline, to make sure that we are telling as much as we can possibly can. The idea that we're going to tell every story is somewhat ridiculous, because that's not possible. So I'll always make sure that everybody knows every time, you have to choose a theme, you have to choose an issue, and you have to make that thematic issue relevant to a wide range when you're talking about exhibition planning and exhibition design. The other thing that is always significant, I think, in terms of, and stop me as soon as I hit 10, is the other thing I think that I'd like to make sure that the audience understands is that if I'm telling a story or I'm developing an exhibition as a curator, my interpretation of that will be different than Dion's, which will be different than Pam's, because as well as yours. So when you walk into a museum and you're looking at a story or looking at an exhibition, you have to realize that that's being told from the curator's or from the researcher's point of view. We all bring in something to that interpretive text. Whether we like to or not, there are some biases, and there's also an area in which we are going to focus our research on. And so, that's one of the things I like to make sure that people understand. It's the same as when you write a book. When you read a book, you look at it and you say, I would have went in this direction. So it's sort of the same concept, because it depends on who the originator is, who the author is. So what we're doing with the museum, in addition to trying to develop the interpretive text and of course designing the museum, and when I say designing the museum, I'm talking about the structural design from the outside in. So when we were talking about museums and you're talking about creating exhibitions, everything has a purpose. Every color has a reason, every ambient sound has a point, every exhibition design has a reason for being there, and should create some type of feeling or evoke some type of emotion from the visitors, so that everything fits together. And that's where we're going right now. And of course, there is going to be some give and take between myself, the exhibition design team, the administration, as well as the community members as they come into the galleries and have their say. So we are on board with the museum development and the exhibition design, and we're moving forward. We have the exhibition design team that communicate with them regularly, and they come in for meetings with us, as well as, you know, making selections of what images are going to be included, what documents are going to be included, whose voices are going to be heard throughout the gallery. So it's a long and a lengthy process. I know oftentimes when I tell people that it's not scheduled to open to December 17th, you say, oh, you have a lot of time. It's like, no, I've already been here 2 years, and it doesn't seem like it at all. And, you know, 2017 comes and goes very quickly when you're talking about developing an exhibition. In routine, you know, if you have a large-scale exhibition, it can take 3 years just for the exhibit itself. And we're talking about developing a museum within that time frame. So I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've just perfect timing. Excellent. I'll give it to you. Yeah.
The other talker in the group. Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center is for us the hub of history in Jackson, Mississippi. A wonderful facility. I've been there since December of 1999. I walked into a facility that was, and let me say this because Jackie said this, and I wanted to also say this also, that as far as history for me, my major was not history either. More like therapeutic recreation and special education. I was the first student from Jackson State University to be placed into a program to put more African Americans into the National Park Service. And at 19 years old, they shipped me to this place called Harpers Ferry, West Virginia for training. And from Harpers Ferry, West Virginia to Catoctin Mountain Park, which was in Thurmont, Maryland. And my job was to be a storyteller to campers that came out at night. And when they came to the little area and came together, and I would put on film presentations and talk about snakes and things like that. The stuff that you don't want to deal with today. From there, I went to Greenbelt National Park, which is right outside of DC. And from there, I came to Vicksburg, the Battlefield National Park here, and worked there for a couple of years until I decided that I wanted to go in another direction. But in 1999, I was led to interview for a position for a manager at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. And I went in with a board of about 8 or 10 people. Dr. Jessie Mosley, who was the founder of the museum, was still alive at that particular time. And she said, hire her, just hire her right now. Okay. So I've always had to feel that I have big shoes to fill, because Dr. Mosley was a little woman, but as I always tell people, she carried a big stick. We came in, and when I got there was not a lot of money in the budget, and still not a lot of money in the budget, but you could see that at that particular time, that the city really didn't appreciate the history and what she was trying to do, going out to the community and doing fundraisings and whatever to make it happen. Harvey Johnson Jr. was the mayor at that particular time when I came in, and he thought to increase the budget, which kept us out tremendously. From him increasing our budget, he increased it again, whereas we had applied for a grant with the Mississippi Arts Commission, and he was able to, instead of us giving a refund back to the Mississippi Arts Commission, he allowed us to keep the $75,000, which helped us tremendously again. The biggest thing with being in a museum under the auspices of the city of Jackson, not state or any municipality, is that there's no money. There's not a lot of money to do anything. Our board is the City of Jackson City Council and the mayor. And I guess I can say that I'm happy that we are under the city and not a private, not a private entity, because with that you have to do a lot of going out there and raising funds. So staff members know that they get a check every 2 weeks. We have a very small staff, We have 2 curators who work part-time. We have a museum preparer who puts up the exhibitions, a secretary and a senior aide, and myself. So we don't do just everybody has their own job. We do everything because it is a small entity, and which at some points that's good because we get intimately involved in our exhibitions. One thing that my mantra is that we give the people what they want. I don't believe that we should go over the patrons' heads and they don't understand what we're talking about. I think that's really an intimidation factor for people who come into museums. Our hardest job is getting African Americans to come into museums, to be a part of the experience of museums, to appreciate the museums, especially when it talks about the history of a people. Our Smith Robertson Museum, we totally talk about the history of the African American in Mississippi. Because as you know, we don't know our history. So we need to start at home. Once we start at home and we're able to tell the story, then we're able to continue on. Again, Rico talked about CNN. For us, that's big. I don't know how big it is for you, but that's big for us because we have such a small staff. One of our staff members, she's here, she's in the back, that's Charlene Thompson. Raise your hand, Charlene. And she is truly responsible for the verbiage that you see. She's responsible for the research. We do a lot of creating our own exhibitions. Not because it's cheaper, but because there are stories that are not being told. And we need to tell those stories. We've done exhibitions on Mount Bio. I call it Mount Bio because the natives called it Mount Bio. And they were so excited because there was never an exhibition that was done on the history of Mount Bio, Mississippi. We've done exhibitions on women of the movement. This is what we do. We create exhibitions. We just did an exhibition on Freedom Summer. And so if we create the exhibitions, what we do is that we call ourselves a teaching tool to be able to teach, to be able to educate. That's what we do at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. Let's talk about the changes that we brought about. Rico talked about the large format graphics that we have. We needed to be in your face because children are visual. They need to be able to see, they need to be able to touch. That's how they get it, that's how they understand. And so when you walk into Smith Robertson, of course we talk about the life and times of Richard Wright, our native son, our black boy. We talk about Smith Robertson School, the beginnings of the school, how it got started, how the name Smith Robertson came about, who is Smith Robertson. We have our David Taylor Gallery that's changing every 3 months. We have fine art, we have folk art. And then you go upstairs, and the students, I wasn't there with you, but I'm sure that Ms. Thompson back there took you through from Africa to Mississippi. That's very poignant, because our children have no idea who they are, and what they come from. So it's important for us to tell that story. We dock you in Natchez, so we dock you at any slave port, and we bring you to the auction block. And right there, where the ancestors were sold. Then we tell you about plantation life. We go on from there, and we go into the Civil War, into Reconstruction, and with the Reconstruction, we're going to be adding on walls because we need to talk about the politics during the Reconstruction era. We also want to talk about the horrifics of slavery because slavery wasn't nice, y'all. And we want to be able to talk about this. So we're adding 3 walls to what you saw the other day. We're also going to do an exhibition on the life and times of the first African-American mayor in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, which is Harvey Johnson Jr. When you go on the back, those who stayed, very important, because my folks stayed in Mississippi, to show you how they lived, to show you what tools they used on a day-to-day basis. All of those things are important in telling the comprehensive story of the African American. And staff members and I myself felt that that was very important for us to do. What we try to do is, let me talk about what we're working on. We do have a wonderful oral history component that we're going to start back up again. Charlene is a part of that also. We have a reading room where the oral histories will be. We have books that if you could just put your hands on those books. We are trying to get the museum Wi-Fi. We want to be able to open up so when you come in, you can do research. We're trying to be a staple to the community. It's very hard with the fundraising part of a museum because, of course, the monies that we get from the city, they don't do everything. But what we've learned at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center is that we do not allow that budget to work us. We work the budget. So if you have $60,000 or $70,000 in your exhibition component of your budget, you have to decide what's best for the community. You have to decide what's best for Mississippi, what's best for the United States and Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. You know, people come into the museum and they remember the old museum. They remember when Dr. Mosley was there. And one thing that they remember is that we had a granddaddy's photograph on the wall. And they expect that same photograph to be up. Can't do it, not after 20-something years. Charlene gets it all the time. And Charlene sends them to me. And I have to be very diplomatic with that because museums are constantly changing. We have to get into the 21st century with museums. So sometimes we can go back and pull them in the artifacts, in the archives. One thing that I found out, which was very trying for me, is that, and truly not talking bad about the former staff members or anything, but one thing that has been very hard for us, and if you get into the field of museums, archiving, that is so important. We have black and white photographs that have no names on them, and their family probably did give them to the museum, but we have no idea who this gentleman is of 1925. We have no idea at all. So that is most important, and that's something that we will be working on forever and a day, trying to make sure that when people walk into that museum and they ask for Uncle Eddie's photo, we're able to scan it and give it to them. Those are just some of the biggest problems that we've had at Smith Robertson. One thing is because when the museum was started, this was something that was started by Dr. Jesse B. Mosley, of course, our wonderful Dr. Alfredine Harrison and others. But just being able to call out to the community, give me things that we think are old, and people bring everything to a museum. It's almost, it could be like a storage room, a storage hall, and you have to decide. They tell me that I'm the person, I'm the bad guy, because we can't take certain things that are not able to be able to tell a story that is a story that will help people in the community learn more about their African American history. You know, one thing that I've learned is that, and I talk about this all the time, and I was talking to Jackie about this just recently, is that people in the community where there's a viable museum don't come and visit the museum. We wonder why. We wonder why. So maybe it's because people are not educated about museums. Maybe it's because if you're not educated about museums, you can't tell your children about museums. You don't bring your children to the museums. And then we wonder why people say there's nothing to do in Jackson, Mississippi. When we have a leading museum that's there, another museum that's going to be built, and we need help. We need help for you to tell the community about us. You know, I'm going to wait because I can go on because I'm very passionate. Only passionate people work at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. And I have to say we have an 18 finally at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. And that's important because with an 18, you're able to do a good job. So I'm going to pass it on to Dion and wait on questions that you may have later.
Thank you, Pam. Yeah, I want to as I'm put on a different hat, I'm put on my board member hat. I'm a board member for AAA, and she mentioned, as a board member, I highly encourage you, anybody that's in the Museum Studies program, come and see what the museum, Rico, he's on the nominating committee, you know, he's the chair of that. It is really worth your time to come down and see what we have. Actually, there's fellowships that you can actually apply for. Now, take that hat off and put on Dion hat. I listen to these two and I'm just in awe. You know, I started out as a military person. I did 21 years in the military, retired, and all of a sudden decided, what am I going to do? My undergrad degree was in HR, and I saw this museum was hiring for an HR manager, so I applied for it. And within 9 months, the president, when she hired, and one thing that's about me is I'm a straight shooter. I want to back up a little bit. So during the interview at this museum, I went down to see, you know, what it looked like, what were they doing with the staff, looked like the diversity and whatnot. And I got down there, and the first question they asked me, have you ever been to the museum before? And I said, yes, this weekend was the first time. They said, what did you think? Excellent museum, but there's no diversity. It's in my exact words, it's pasty white. Those were my exact words. I just knew I had blew it because the interview itself went on fine. But afterwards, the president of the museum said that's exactly why I was hired, because I told the truth. They didn't know how to go about diversifying the workforce. They thought they could just put it on Career Builder or put it in the help one of the ads or whatnot, and it doesn't. It takes more that you have to actually go after the demographics that you're trying to do. At that museum, we did over 187,000 people a year, and you had no Hispanics at the front desk greeting people. You had no African Americans, nobody. So to speed up, once we put measures in place to diversify, what we start seeing was more African American people coming. We started seeing more Indian, Pakistani, different nationalities coming to the museum to enjoy it, who hadn't had a time to come there. A year into that job, that president retired, and we got a new one named Al Maloney, who by all means was my mentor, and I wouldn't be where I am as far as museums go if it wasn't for him. He came in and he saw what I was doing, and I had the tenacity. You have to, like you were talking about, the passion. You have to have a passion for what you're doing. This was a science and technology center, so it was just the opposite of a AAHC. So I just had a tenacity for business. And so immediately he promoted me to director of HR and earned income operations. And at that point, I surrounded myself with some good people, which is key. You can't do anything by yourself. You got to put yourself with good people. Under our leadership or whatnot, he told me I had a year to turn around our cafe. And in 1 year, we went from $48,000 a year to $168,000 a year. And it was all common sense stuff, you know. The current manager, the manager they had, didn't believe in doing fried foods. Well, if you're a children's museum, kids want hot dogs, hamburgers, french fries. Turned it over that, and it turned around, and I looked like a genius over there. So then he put me in front, and he promoted me again to be the director of development. And I said, I have no inkling to want to do development. And he said, you need to learn this, because one day you're going to be an executive director, and I don't want them to be able to blow smoke up your butt. So I went through IUPUI. He sent me to IUPUI through their philanthropy school, got my certification, and so I did that for another year. After that, he said, okay, these people don't know, so I'm going to promote you this year to COO, and then next year, vice president, which means in his term, it meant the same thing. This all was going on over the course of 5 years. And so he did that, then he gets fired, it cost me some money, but anyway. And so I'm talking more from the business side, and you know, the history they have. I wish I had that passion. I learned every time I go to AAAM. But what I did was the business, you know, more of the behind the scene administrative side of it. And so I interviewed, when that director, Mr. Maloney, retired, they went out to a search firm to hire somebody. And I didn't apply because it was a lot. Working with boards is difficult, and CO, I saw what you had to go through. Well, the recruiter came in, and the headhunter, he came in and he interviewed the staff, the board, and everything, see what they were looking for. afterwards, he went back to the board and said, I will take your money, but that's the man the staff respects, and that's who is qualified to do this job. And they said, no, we need to go and do a national search. So they did, and on the last day, I submitted my resume, and the recruiter called, the headhunter called me and said, thank you for applying. I was afraid you wouldn't. Time goes by, and the search committee wanted the top 5. Well, my name was in it. They sent it back and said, we only want the top 3. Sent it back. I'm still there. What I'm getting at, racism, overt, covert, is everywhere. We had a black mayor, and I couldn't prove this, but I could go into details of what was being done behind the scenes. But we had it's the jewel of the city of Wichita. We get our $5 million budget, 2.5 came from the county. So they weren't ready, I don't think, at that time. Well, when it came down to it, they ended up hiring somebody else, and she's still there. She's a great lady. And so I ended up, the same person wanted me to interview for a job out in Las Vegas for the National Museum of Organized Crime and Law Enforcement. I said, okay, I'll do it. And again, it was between me and another guy. He had been executive director. I was on the operations side. And they decided to go with the executive director. 3 months later, he calls me again. Got the perfect job. Where? B.B. King Museum. Cool. Memphis? No. That's the best misconception I'm asked all the time. Where you at, Memphis? No. It's in his hometown in Indianola, Mississippi. Town. It used to be 12,000, now 10,000. Came down, and when I interviewed, I told them, I said, what's your main concerns you want? They said a balanced budget, because they had been 2 years without an executive director. And they said, what about you? And I said, well, I'm from the school. After reading everything I read about this, I understand the tension of this town. I understand how the blacks view the museum. I understand how the whites view the museum. There's a lot of walls that has to be broken down. So for every tourist dollar that comes in here, goes right back into the community. And that's what we've successfully been able to do over the years. We turned over the staff probably 3 times. My first year there, it turned over within 6 months, because before there was no accountability. Now there's accountability. Once you have accountability and giving people ownership, they'll run through the wall for you. And by creating, and what I did, I wanted programs. We did a summer camp. Obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, I may have just said that. Those are #1 concerns down there, and literacy. And so what were we doing to address that community? That's one of our principles. Another principle is to bring the community together. We were doing, at that time, we were doing more social events in the museum than community outreach. And so what was happening, you had social events going on, but the blacks were afar looking at it saying, that's not our museum. That's the history behind some of it. And the museum started out, was going to be a $200,000 storefront downtown. And the consultants came in and said, if you're going to do it big. And grew into this $14 million project. With that, right upon completion, Hurricane Katrina happened and set them back $1 million. So it ended up being a $15 million project. They raised $14 million. They did a heck of a job raising funds to have it literally paid off when they opened the doors, except for that $1 million increase. Luckily, my first board meeting, it was actually at that time it was 1.6 million, and going to the fundraising story, I said in my first year I want to retire the debt. Oh, you're crazy, can't do it. Everybody's donor fatigue. Well, I said, well, I'll start it and I'll do 5,000, because if you're going to be executive director, you need to pay for what you work. You get a paycheck in the military. If you're the NCO, you belong to the NCO club. Well, we passed that on to our staff. Only a couple, do it, but that's okay. But by me starting it out at 5,000 over 5 years, and that's why I broke it down to them. I told them it's not a difficult thing to do. If you take $1,000 and break it down over 26 weeks, I think it comes out to like $38. You blow that. And so there's so many things you can cut to raise $1,000 a year. You gotta have those big ones, but there's also those people like me that give $1,000 a year. And so when I said 5,000 over 5 years, board member said, I'll do 10 over 5 years. Another one said 25, another one said 50. So before we went out to raise our first dollar, we had a commitment from 100% on our board to go out and talk. And luckily, blessed, we went out, and within a year, we had reduced that $1.6 million debt down to $166,000. So, and that was within the first year. So, going back to the programming and fundraising, they all go together. We do a newsletter, Rico mentioned, once a month. We used to send emails out every week when I first got there, every week. Well, I don't want to inundate because I'm going to delete those emails. But if I can capture everything within a month of what we do, you're more likely to sit and read that one. And when it's done, we send it out to over 3,000 people, and we get data back to say how many are deleting, how many new people are signing up. I can tell you that on one person, they called me from, he's a retired EMI executive, called me and made a $10,000 donation just from reading the work that we're doing in the Delta with the children within Sunflower County. One of the programs we do is called the Art of Smart program, and it consists of a spring break program, after school, summer camp, and after school. When I got there, the after school portion wasn't included. We didn't have one, but there was a need for it because these kids would leave, they weren't getting that healthy education. So what we do is we bring them in, give them 30 minutes of exercise, help them with their homework. Parents had them there in droves because by the time they got home, when we hired teachers to come in and work, the kids, they showed improvement, especially our summer camp program. It showed that over the summer, and this is the kind of information you need when you're out there beating the streets for money. It showed that most kids lost 30% of their retention value over the summer. This past year, they retained 80%. It was the highest ever. And any Promise community produced those numbers for us. And it shows that it works and what we do work, and that makes our staff feel good. But when it makes us feel good, I get to go talk to potential donors for fundraising and showing you have the hard data to show that it's working. Because of those programs, now, through IMLS, my education department is completely funded. Then also my after school, all those programs, that's a $118,000 grant. And it's all through the program. You have to break down barriers because I had to stop doing, I used to put it in the paper, B.B. King Museum receives this grant, B.B. King receives this grant. Well, people are saying, we don't need to give you money because you get all this money coming in. But people don't understand what grants is pass-through money. You're providing a service for the community. Yeah, you may get 15% off for indirect cost. That's nothing in the big scheme of things. The rest of it, you're putting it back into the community because you're hiring people to do this, the teaching, to put on these programs. So it's getting right back. And so I had board of supervisors and city council and aldermen wasn't aware that that's what we were doing, was putting money right back into the community as far as paying, but it's also the programming that we would give these kids. Those kids get these programs free. There's no charge for after-school programs, summer camp. We don't charge for anything when it comes to kids. From that, we promote to the state. We become, as Rico's talking, we have to sell our history, it's part of the creative economy. Before we opened, since the museum opened, we've opened 7 restaurants since then. We had hotels, but it was hotels that tour buses wouldn't stay in because in their mind it was substandard. Well, because of the success of the museum and the amount of business that we do in the community, now we're getting ready to get a Hampton Inn actually going to break ground in October, a 65-bedroom, beds, which is going to cause people to stay. What's important to me out of that is when the builders did this, they were smart enough that we have a tourism tax. So for every dollar that's spent on lodging or food, we get 2% of that, which is great. If it wasn't for that, we close the doors. I'm gonna leave it there. What's to come for us? Real quick, I'm gonna say what's to come, and I'm gonna step back. And I can talk about programs and everything these two nice young ladies talked about. I just want to throw this money side on it because everybody's touched on fundraising. What's coming up for us? Mr. King donated Historic Club Eddie to us in 2012. He donated a tour bus, his tour bus. And so we're in the process of renovating it. The only thing that's stopping us from running now is the air conditioning. But my goal on the earned income side again is that's a potential. It's not a potential. We get called daily on can people rent that, and they're gonna. And we've already built this Ride Like the King. You know, we're getting labels made so you'll know where everybody said at in his band, and you get to go up on it. We'll take it to. You can tour it or you can take it out on the road. Doesn't matter to us. There's gonna be a hefty, price tag on it, but it's a good source of earned income for the museum. Thank you.
I just know we got first dibs on that bus ride. Oh, no comment, see,
No,
it's
it's
not
not
a question, you know.
To be honest with you, we got a road test, and so we're making a path, and Jackson's on the list, so of course we'll stop out. There you go.
Right.
We're gonna stay on you with one question because you mentioned when you started about this tension in the community. So I want you to discuss or talk about, in terms of leadership, how did the community, black and white, respond to your leadership initially? You coming on board as an outsider from Kansas City, coming to the Mississippi Delta. How did the community?
Can we talk frank?
Yes.
Let's do it. That's me. I was always told don't ask a question you don't want to answer to because I'll give you the answer. You may not like it, but it's going to okay. The museum, I won't say all museums, in Indianola, it's a town of 10,000 people. That's where the White Citizen Council started. So the town was still divided by railroad tracks. There's Indianola Academy, and then there's Gentry as far as the high schools. 98% of IA's population is white, 98% of Gentry is black. Just give you a little background, small background. Well, what I had to do, I went to the Club Ebony. There's an older gentleman named, I won't say his name, he's 71-year-old, he was sitting there, cigar in his mouth, and I was wanting to go there to meet some of the black community. Get there, he says, you that token ass so-and-so they done brought in here. Because prior to me, they had a white lady running the museum for the first 2 years. She opened it and did a hell of a job. Well, I said, excuse me, sir, I don't know you. Did you read my resume? He said, don't need to. I know you that token. And I left it at that, went inside, talked to everybody else. And so I had to battle that within the black community. So now, I go over to the white bar. When I first got there, I had to pick and choose days. Thursday I was at this club, Friday I was at this club, Saturday I had to go out there and show who I was for them to understand it. And so the same thing would happen in the white clubs too. And so it was frustrating, but I knew that coming into it, I wasn't naive enough. I knew when I got here, when I was outside, I'm gonna say this and I'll let it go. I asked my board chair, how's the community gonna accept me when you announce that I'm hired? So he started sending me all these emails. See, Deon, they love you, they love you. I'm not talking about that crowd. I'm talking about this crowd because I knew how a lot of my people are raised think, and they were going to call me the token, which I got called the first day there. But now that same 71-year-old, he volunteers at the museum. He's the biggest supporter of the museum, maybe not financially, but the works that he does do, and he's just an advocate for the museum. And so now the museum has a great relationship with both communities. Everything we do is geared, before we do a program, it has to serve both.
Not just, well, you want to follow up?
I just want to, does it help bring the communities together? Is that?
Yes and no. I mean, it's a deep history there. I'll give you one example. We have Jazz Night. That right there is held at the museum. We'll get maybe 50 people, and it's probably a 60-40 split either way. If we take that same event and take it across the tracks at Club Ebony, then you're gonna have, people are afraid to come across, because they don't know because of the history of that street. So, yeah, and so when we do events like that, we'll do them during daylight hours. And we had an event and it brought the community together. But what's crazy is that if there's 20 tables in there, every other table, this table will be black, this table will be white, this table will be black. And it was like that until the music started playing and the beer started going down. everybody melt, because we all work together, but it's socializing. That's what we use the museum for, is to bring the community together.
On that same note, or in that same vein, Ms. Dace, so many in our community are concerned that since the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum will be state-run, that the stories told about the struggle for civil and human rights may be watered down. What's your response to that?
I want to respond twofold. Number one, I'll respond with what Dion said also. I'm an outsider as well. And so I always have to, as I introduce myself, I have a long history in Mississippi. So I learned that I have to be able to tell why I belong, you know, and how I belong in Mississippi in order for me to be accepted as an individual. And additionally, I mean, it hasn't been told to me personally that I'm a token, but it has been felt to me that I'm the token. And one of the things, and actually one of my friends said, well, that's what people expect. Until they get to know you, they don't know who you are, you know. Once they get to know who you are, then they are kind of surprised that they even hired you, you know, because what I said when I was interviewed, just as Dion mentioned, I've been in this field for 20 years. And I didn't, not only necessarily progression of my career, I'd love to tell people, or I don't love to tell people, but I can hand you my work. I don't have to express it to you, I can prove it to you, I can hand it to you. You can Google my name, you can see my background. So I don't have to prove myself in the field of museology. But also my reputation is at stake. So I wouldn't have come if I believed that the story was going to be watered down. That's been one of the main conversations that I constantly have, as you say, can we talk? As we're within the boardrooms, is that we're telling the complete story. The Mississippi Civil Rights story is ugly, and it impacts some of the leaders of the Mississippi community, some of the leaders in the political structure of the Mississippi community. And if you begin to try to water it down or soft pedal it or go around certain issues, then people know the truth, you know. And not only do they know the truth within the state of Mississippi, they know the truth outside the state of Mississippi. So one of the things that we have to do as we're talking about the civil rights struggle, and also if we're talking about how we're going to change the how Mississippi views itself and how Mississippi is viewed nationally, we need to be able to put all our cards on the table. And we want to move forward, and we don't want to be having the same problems that we're having today. We need to start having these open, honest dialogue and conversations and stop talking to each other and or stop talking at each other and start talking to each other and start being able to hear each other's conversations, you know. So I understand that there's still some trepidation in the community as to whether or not the state of Mississippi is going to tell the accurate story. And I know we have to prove ourselves, you know. I mean, that's the reality of it. The reality of it, I came from, as I mentioned, the Missouri Historical Society. Missouri Historical Society was also a white, male elitist dominated institution, you know. And here I am, this African American person, talking about creating projects and programs in African American history, and I wasn't getting funded either internally in terms of developing projects. So I said, okay, I know what to do. I can go outside and get funds, you know. So I got grants from granting organizations. One of the biggest was the Rockefeller Foundation, you know, and they said that they wouldn't fund us. And when I say they, I'm talking about my own administration said the Rockefeller Foundation wouldn't fund you. And Rockefeller said, yeah, we will. You know, there are ways to get your work done and get it done right. And my own personal belief, as both Dion and Pam have said, you got to be passionate for this to be involved in it, because we ain't gonna get rich. You will not get rich in the field of museology, okay? So if you don't have a passion for what you're doing, and doing it, and the other thing that I've learned is that people can tell whether or not you're real or not. You know, you can tell whether or not I'm coming to you and I care about your story, or whether or not I'm just doing it at the surface, you know. And you get a different story according to who you send out to collect that story, you know. And so I think that as a person that is genuine about this, not only the history of the civil rights movement, but also genuine about making sure that the scholarly story is told accurately. I think people understand that, and again, I wouldn't be here if we were going to tell a watered down story. So it really is, for me, it's that simple. I wouldn't be here.
Thanks so much. I was hoping to get rich.
Sorry.
Arts.
We
And
go.
the students too, I know you're hoping, but anyway, we're gonna change that paradigm.
Yeah, well, let me say this.
Yeah,
My
please.
thing is, you know, what I find is that I have to go out and talk up for the Civil Rights Museum, because people are coming to me and saying, well, you should be the Civil Rights Museum. Why did it? And I can't get into the political, you know, the whole situation as far as that's concerned, because I wasn't sitting at the table. I didn't make the decisions. I was at the Condominium speaking, and Jackie wasn't there, but some of the people that work with her were there, and they were all white, and they came to hear me speak, and I had to end up at the end taking up for the Civil Rights Museum because they were just jumping on those ladies. And what we believe is that we're going to have a partnership. We have to have a partnership. We have to work this thing together. You go there, you go there, and they tell you about us, and they come to us. They come to us, and we tell them to go to the Civil Rights Museum. So no competition on our parts as we see it, but the community sees it as competitive.
Right. So, keep the mic. You face a different set of issues at Smith Robertson, and one of them is the decline in Jackson in the last few years, last few decades actually. We just learned that Barrett Street, it's been put on hold again through a lawsuit. So with this being the case, how do you foresee the future of Smith Robertson in its relation to the development or underdevelopment of Jackson?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm always dealing with it. I am one to walk the community. I think I've taken more photographs of the blighted community than anybody in Jackson, and sending it to our community improvement division with the city of Jackson to say, when are we going to get these houses either down or rehabbed? And then you have that situation where, you know, they don't want to actually take the house down because it has historic value. So those are things you have to deal with. I'm dealing right now with a lady who sleeps on a porch every night. And you have to make a decision, how do you handle that? Because not only are you working with the homeless, but you're working with her problems also. It's terrible, Dr. Chapman. You know, I've been thinking about some projects, and I've talked to staff members about it as far as Fair Street is concerned. If we don't do anything, we have to make it pretty. We have to make it where people want to walk on Fair Street. I don't know how long that this situation will be in litigation. I have no idea. But right now, what can we do? We can get muralists out and have them to come on Fair Street, put up boards and have students from Jackson State, from Belhaven and Millsaps to take on that project of helping to beautify it by putting up art. And I think that's going to be one of the ways that we do it. Working for the city of Jackson, this is just so much I can say. And I'm being very honest, being frank here, like Dion, because it's not a private institute, so we don't want anybody to go back and say Pam Jr. was saying something bad about the persons that give her check. So I have to be very careful in that. But this is one thing, again, that we're doing. We're making sure that our community improvement division knows about the houses, and that we see them, that we want to know what's going to happen to them. The house just burned down last week. I was right there taking photographs of it. I've already sent that house to community improvement, because as you know, it being such an old community, whereas that people left those houses to their children, the children moved away. Some of the children even changed their names because they didn't want to have that connection to their ancestors. So the houses are there, and the city can't do anything because, of course, if you pay to get the house torn down, then there's problems with that. And then do you want to tear all the houses down? You have some of the most prominent people that lived in that community that did so much during the civil rights movement. So it's twofold. How do you decide? Do you want to have it sitting like that? Or where do you find the monies to rehab the houses? So it's a lot dealing with that, and something that we deal with every day because people are afraid to come into the community because of how it looks. GPS takes you right through the hood. It won't give you the interstate direction, but it takes you right through the hood. And people see this wonderful facility when they get to Smith Robertson and say, you guys are right here in the middle of it. So yes, a lot to deal with, but you know, we're just doing the best we can. Of course, you said something about the communities declining. And not only with the Fair Street, but that's the one that's most prominent. You go in South Jackson, you have the same things.
Yeah. I have several questions, but I'll give the audience a chance. You got yours in there.
Okay,
But go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Oh, no. Okay. Well, I just wanted to ask you guys to talk a little bit about the differences in your board leadership. Like, for example, you mentioned that your board, you went from having an actual board with Dr. But so now the city of Jackson is your board. You have, I would guess, an elected board or a private, or just, I mean, just, and maybe, and discuss just a little bit about the leadership that's with the Civil Rights Union as well, in comparison to see the different freedoms. Is it better? Is it worse? And how does that, what kind of challenges that give you with raising money?
My board, it's a give and take. You know, boards are tricky. This is the second institution that had worked with a board, and they all seem to have the same characteristics. You have a few that's engaged. Yeah, you have a few engaged, and luckily I have a small board of 12 people. And the good thing is that it's not, Indianola is only 10,000 people. And so only 4 of the board members are from Indianola. The rest are in Jackson or spread out. But I intentionally had, when we turned over, I started putting elected officials on there. If you want your word out there, get somebody, get a board of aldermen, get a county board of supervisor. But outside of, but my board works great when I need them. They're there. To me, unfortunately, we were successful raising funds, so they figured Dion got it, but Dion needs you, and so I have to keep on engaging them. One quick thing about one of our board members I want to touch on. We have a program called BB's Bridge Building Ambassadors, and in it, one of the books they're required to read is the Let the People Decide. And in that book, they talk about Big Jim Eastland. His son is on my board. He comes and speaks to the kids. He's a very prominent guy. I mean, the community itself supports the museum in their own ways, and that board member, he really wants to come and help out the kids on our ambassador program.
We are looking at starting a Friends of Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center, which will be an advisory board, fundraising board. Young lady that was at Jackson State University, she contacted me to talk to us about doing that. There is a board that's called the Association for the Preservation of Smith Robertson School / Alamo Theater. And they were the organization that started the museum. But we are not preserved anymore. We are a museum. We are a viable museum. So we are trying to work on getting a board. Because we are a municipality, we do have to take everything through our city council. We do have to take everything through our mayor of the city of Jackson and present what we're going to do as we would if it were a board. For me, it's okay because I know these people and they want the best for the museum. They do have questions, and you want them to have questions. Our chore is trying to make sure that we get this board, the Friends of the museum together, young folks who are passionate like the staff members are, so that they can go out and raise money and make sure that we have what we need.
All right, there are a number of ways I want to answer this question. One of the things I'll say is that when I respond, know that I'm an old school museum person. So I was mentored by the old school museology folks as I came into the field. And I still believe in the traditional concepts of the museum, you know. And by that I'm saying I've worked in private institutions, public institutions, now finally a state institution, so there's a significant difference. As board defines in my mind, we do not have a board. The Mississippi Civil Rights Museum does not have a board because we do not have a museum yet. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History, which is our governing entity, has a board that is the board in which we technically respond to. Or that are some of the decision makers for the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We do have an advisory commission that you know, we report to and update on the progress of the museum. We also have a scholarly committee that that assists us with the development of the interpretation of the museum itself. But as boards are defined by, you know, American Alliance of Museums, we do not technically have a board yet for the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. You asked the questions whether or not having a private entity versus a entity that's with the city or the state, whether it's better or worse. There is give and take in all aspects. You know, I think one of the things that, especially as it relates to what I've seen with African American museums, especially with smaller entities, is that you have individuals that are on the board that are not participating board members. And what needs to happen is, because when you, and I'll continue to mention the American Alliance of Museums because that's sort of like our guiding doctrine of institutions for museums. Whether you're an accredited institution or not, there are best practices within the American Alliances of Museums that we should all practice, because we're all supposed to be accountable to the public. The board members are supposed to be accountable to the institution. Dion mentioned that his board members, you know, donated money to the building of the institution. That's actually what they're all supposed to do. You know, they all are supposed to have a fiduciary responsibility to their institution. You're not just supposed to sit on the board just so you can sit on the board, but unfortunately, too often, that's what happens, and that's what we allow. And coming from, you know, and having worked with some of the, or worked with, whether it worked with as full-time employee or consulting purposes, I have worked with many African American museums, and I know that one of the main things I'll tell them to do is change your board structure. You shouldn't have somebody sit on your board for 25 years and they haven't given you $500. Or they, you know, they are not taking any level of responsibility for the CEO or for anybody that's the operation of the museum, or they don't even come to any of the museum functions. You know, so that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But so anyway, I'm not going to continue, but trust you me, I can.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I've enjoyed, good evening, I've enjoyed the discussion, and I'm like Ms. Junior, people who say that there's nothing to do in Jackson, Mississippi, they just don't know what's going on, Marvin gets what's going on.
Well, you're everywhere, so.
But and I like to say this, that getting that information out there, because I have not been to the, and let me say about Miss Junior's museum, I was there for the play that was put on here several months ago. That was awesome. I can say when it hits Broadway, I saw it in Jackson, Mississippi, at the Smith Robinson Museum.
Thank you.
Yes, and I appreciate you for that. But one day, and just to give you just a little humanistic part of this, I don't have any children, but I have these nephews and nieces. So they go to one of the places that they have to visit, and they've been there numerous times, the Smith Robinson Museum. And one day I took them, and they went through the exhibit of the women, the women of the civil rights. So I get off work the next day, and I go by their house. They don't live with me. And one of them said, "I've got my essay ready." And I thought, and he had seen the exhibit and knew about the essay contest, and he had it prepared when I came by their house the next day. And just to make it short, this young man won that contest for the state of Mississippi. And
Yes, Freedom Sisters.
Freedom Sisters. And it was just a blessing for him, and then for them to participate in something like that. And I was just surprised. But you don't know about it. I found out about the B.B. King Museum and I had it in my hand. I used to go more often. We were closer to the building. History is Lunch series. So the lady, I guess, was your predecessor who did the presentation that day. Now my mind said, we have to change our paradigm. There are many, the possibilities of Mississippi are just unlimited. Now I'm not just being prejudiced. But she made the statement that of all the museums she had worked with or had been affiliated with in the United States, she said that was one of the top ones. But what really got was she said now, because my mind was B.B. King music. But when they began to expound on that this was an interpretive museum, I said, what's going on here? So I really haven't been there, but I'm trying to wait until I can get this little group together, all of them together, and bring them there for a tour. Because it's more than what my little mind could conceive of. And I appreciate that. I want to get up there. I think some of these schools, teachers should take their groups up there and maybe take a pilgrimage. I think we've got a lot going on. I think the people around the United States who lost their connection to Mississippi or to the South, pilgrimages would be excellent for them. You would regain a lot. So I really appreciate you all. And Miss Dace, I see her everywhere. I appreciate her and all she's doing. I'm just excited because it's here, it's happening. But with you all, I appreciate it.
Let me just say, I've spoken on fundraising and programs that we do. I haven't even talked about the museum. Real quick, if I get 2 minutes. The museum uses B.B. King to tell the story, but the museum itself is about the civil rights. It's about the Sunflower County. I mean, you have Fannie Lou Hamer. You name it. It's more than B.B.
Right.
I mean, it takes you on a journey from the beginning with a 6-minute opening concert and walks you through his times in Memphis, to the time spent on the bus, and to the end where the quote is saying B.B. King is bigger, not a star, he's the moon. You know, so it's more than about Mr. King. It's a story woven in there.
ECU talked about community development around dealing with museums. As a college student, what are some of the programs to, I guess, get us involved in helping you guys with community development?
I'll shoot first since I still hold it. We do an intern program. Actually, we just had, through a grant, we had somebody come in and Ms. Junior talked about the archival process. And so we had somebody come in and do them, and so that's one way we engage. But as a museum itself, besides work-related, what we do is try to do programming, especially with fraternities. Actually, this month is Greek month. Whatever organization comes in and has the most fraternities come in, they will get a free rental out of it. You know, just to get them engaged into the museum. As a matter of fact, the admission is free. We want you to come in and tour, because if we don't grab youngsters, now as you were talking earlier, it's never passed on. I wasn't taken to a museum as a kid. I mean, I didn't start doing it until I started working at one, actually. You know, but it's a shame, but my kids now, that's a different story. Everywhere we travel, they go into them.
The one thing we do is that, since my background is here at Jackson State University Parks and Recreation, we do have interns and seniors who do their practicum. We had Keith Longino, who did his practicum at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. And then, of course, the city of Jackson has a summer program where they hire youth. So we usually have 3 or 4 youth that come in. Do we need to make it better? Yes, honestly, we need to make our program better. our thing is that we're so involved in trying to get Smith Robertson like we want it to be that we've forgotten. And that's one thing that we need to look at. I'm very honest about that. Is getting you involved more in Smith Robertson Museum, because what you think, what you say is so important. So thanks for bringing that up for me.
And we're still in the development phase in a lot of ways. I mean, there are a lot of things, trust you me, that I want to do, that I've done in the museums, that I've worked, that I want to see applied here as well. Not only the interns, and we do have internship availabilities through the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, that they are now, when Keith was, I'm sorry, Keith, who was Keith? There Keith is. When Dion was talking, he was talking about paid internships. Most of our internships are unpaid. And that's one of the things that discourages some students from taking internships. However, I would very like to encourage you to take unpaid internships, because it's a way of getting your foot in the door. It's also a way of getting practical hands-on experience. And even, you know, when I was in St. Louis, I saw, you know, I had to make an effort to get African Americans to be interns into the museum, you know, because just like Keith said, honey, Keith, quit talking about me. Just like Dion said, you know, many African American students do not go to the museums. They haven't been exposed to it, so they don't know what these institutions can offer. You also don't know what it offers you as a student as you're continuing your level of education. So a couple of things that I know that, you know, we're working on, I'm working on not only in my mind, but also in terms of trying to develop it for the future, is to continue and to expand upon the internship program. Also to start more public programming in terms of offering what I've been called, and it's trademark Rico, so you can't take it, is the research in progress program, where, you know, as you're developing your original research, you'll have a public format where you can present your research and have a give and take, you know, so that you'll be able to understand where other repositories may be, or where you'll be able to talk to individuals that are working in that area. But the other thing that, you know, we would like to develop is community-based programs. So in that respect, we can get more students, especially college students, high school students, involved in not only mentoring, but in leading these community-based programs, where they are much more familiar with, and those would more than likely be grant-funded projects where there would be some level of a stipend. So there are a number of ways that you can get involved in the museum, whether it's within our African American museums or the other museums that are around your state. Because one thing I want people to understand is that, you know, your tax money pays for many of these institutions, whether it's you know, directly impacted through the city museums, state museums, or the private institutions in one way or the other. But you need to become aware, and you need to make sure that these institutions are doing what you want them to do. And as well as you need to be actively involved. I mean, when Pam's talking about that she's the one running around taking pictures and talking to the city administrators, you know, the rest of the community should be concerned about what's going on in their neighborhood as well, and also raising a buckus, and, you know, and coming out and supporting her in terms of what it looks like around that area. There are examples. It can happen. You know, there are examples around the nation. Anacostia Museum in D.C. was, you know, is placed in an area that people didn't want to get out of their car when that institution was originally built. And, you know, there's been a lot of changes that's happened in that community over time as a result of the Anacostia Museum. There are examples of institutions that help to be that ground, that framework of the larger community, and you know, museums do much more than just display and exhibition.
Let me just say this. I was just thinking about the question again, and how many little small museums there are all through the state of Mississippi, and especially in the Delta. We were at one this weekend, and our chore is to go back and help to do the work, because a lot of people are just building, trying to have a small little museum to tell a story. They need folks like you to come to these places and help them in their archival process, to help them to figure out how do we tell, to interpret whatever the story is. So there are many places. I know we passed about 5 or 6 of them just this weekend, driving through, going to Fannie Lou Hamer's birthday celebration. So not only here, and a lot of you can't go outside because of the funds that you have to be able to stay in an area like that. But if it's close enough and you have a vehicle, there are places outside of Jackson that need your help, that can really make your resume look good.
And you would be on the ground floor. I mean, you would be on the ground floor helping these institutions document their history, record their archival documents, and helping to assess what it is that they have, and also making contacts with other professionals, because one of the biggest problems that the smaller institutions or these storefront institutions have is they don't have a professional level staff. And so you have this knowledge base that you're getting here at JSU that can be used in these other institutions. Pam was talking about the museum that we were at in Gruville. So you have that institution in Gruville. One of the places we went to last week was the Canton Freedom House. The Canton Freedom House has a wonderful repository of documents and photographs and information there. What they need is help. They need the manpower. They need people to be there that can help them to, record what it is that they have. And, if we don't know what's out there, you have no idea whether or not, you can learn from these different repositories that are collected within these communities throughout the state. So, there are a lot of ways you can reach out also, and these institutions would benefit from that as well. I'm so glad you brought that up.
On that note, I want to squeeze just this one question in because it relates. On that note, Ms. Davis, I know there has been a challenge in donations, people to donate artifacts to Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. So why do you think this is so, and what can we do to help encourage our community to donate what many consider to be family heirlooms?
There are a lot of issues around why the donations haven't been as vast as I would like to see them in terms of the 3-dimensional artifacts. Now, in terms of the 2-dimensional objects, we have a significant, collection of documents and photographs, not telling the complete story of the civil rights movement throughout Mississippi, but we have a significant collection. But me, I'm a curator. I like the 3D objects, and I think those are the ones that really do tell the story. But it's a lot of reasons. Number one, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History wasn't collecting African American history. So, you have 150 years being in operation where you were collecting the history of the white community and not collecting the history of minorities or African Americans. So you have a big gap in what you have within your collection. That's no different than many of the mainstream institutions throughout the nation in terms of what they saw was important to the story of American history, So, and in reality, one of the reasons why the African American museums became so much more prolific since the 1970s is because nobody else was telling our story. So we began to tell our own story. We began to build our own museums. We began to, as Pam said, take in everything. Initially, there was no censorship in what was taken. It was just like, okay, bring it, and we will keep it. And so then what museums found themselves having is like a hoarder situation, because they have all this stuff that has absolutely no provenance whatsoever, and you don't know what it is and where you can get it. So one of the things is because we hadn't been collecting. Two of the things is because there's no trust. You know, and you have to build that trust. You have to, you know, you have to prove yourself. So, you know, that goes back to that concept also. Three, you mentioned before, you know, whether or not we're going to tell the story as honest and truthfully as possible. And so once I believe in my mind that, you know, people begin to see how these stories are told, they're going to want to become involved with it. They're going to want to be able to have, you know, their stories told within this museum. So there'll be, you know, an increase in the collection. There's other competition or issues as well. You know, you have the National African American History Museum and Cultural Center that's being built in Washington, D.C. under the rubric of the Smithsonian. So if I can get my stuff at the Smithsonian, I'm going to donate it to Lonnie Bunch, which, you know, he's driving me crazy. So, you know, we'll donate it to Lonnie as opposed to donating it to the local institutions, if that's a possibility. There are other things that are also, you know, keeping people from donating. You have eBay. People believe that there is some level of financial worth to the objects. And you also have Antiques Roadshow. You know, I mean, the growth of Antiques Roadshow and the growth of eBay have encouraged people that there is a monetary value to their objects as opposed to historical value. And actually, the truth of the matter is most of the objects have a much more historical value than it has a monetary value. So what you'll find is people are holding on to this stuff hoping that they're going to get this big hit. And, you know, the truth of the matter is what's going to happen is they'll die off and their children are going to throw it away. And once again, we're losing our history, you know. So that's the scary part for me. And trust you me, I've been in, you know, the spider web basements and attics and storage rooms and facilities and climb or up and down steps and, you know, and to get these objects that otherwise, I was just talking to somebody the other day, and that may have been earlier today, about when I was in St. Louis, and there was this county historical society, White County Historical Society. There was this gentleman who had moved out of the house. His son had taken it over. They had contacted them to see whether or not they wanted his father's collection, because otherwise they were going to throw it away. And so the County Historical Society, because they didn't know who the person was, and it was a black person, and I was black, and I was a curator, so, you know, they called me, and they, you know, said, are you interested? The dumpsters are coming tomorrow. This man, I can't think of his name right now, but they wanna collect it. So I had to put on my professional level hat and says, well, I'll see, I'll give them a call, you know, and inside I'm like, yeah, you know, you have no idea who this man is, you know, you have absolutely no idea, not only his local, his national, his international significance to the American historical story. So I go and get a truck immediately and drive over to his house, you know, and pick up these objects because it's underneath this plastic and it had been raining and I'm afraid this stuff is going to mold. But as I'm arriving, the dumpsters are arriving. So had I not immediately jumped on this stuff would have went into the dumpsters, you know? And so there are a lot of reasons why we don't know our worth. And the kids, you know, nobody is passing it on and saying, you know, because when mama and daddy pass on, it's like, I just need to clean this house out. Boom. And somebody might come in that is a collector. They're going to put it in their collection, and they're going to raise the price that's going to make it prohibitive for any of the smaller African American museums to be able to purchase, and it's going to sit on their shelves until it rots, you know. So we need to be able to, in a lot of ways, to understand what the worth is of ourselves, of our story, of our contributions to the story as well.
As culture centers, in this era of where the curriculum is focused on testing, passing tests, and math and sciences, how do culture centers create programs to fit that curriculum?
You know, I'm fighting that every day because of the testing now, and I'm me and the superintendent, we're not friends right now because of that. Because of the fact our children are not getting it. They're not getting anything in regards to their African American culture at all, because everything is dealing with the standardized test, and there's no questions about that type of Mississippi history. I get emotional about it because I'm very upset when the children. What I am doing is I am working on a curriculum that I give to the teachers. I am working on giving them information about Richard Wright, information about the teachers in the area so that they can have it, they can teach them, give it to their students, talk to their students about it, so when they get to Smith Robertson, they'll have an idea of what they're seeing and what they're being taught about. Because if we don't do it, it's not getting taught in the school.
What we did, because it was like what you're saying, is people look at cultural institutions as a field trip, but we're a valuable tool to a community. And so what we did is we went and got a grant, and we had the core curriculum written for our museum to match the state standards. Then we went on to every school that would accept us, gave them copies of it, talked them through how it matched up to core curriculum. Now we're starting to see those people. Actually, we just got 170 kids call, talk to teachers wanting to bring this spring for that reason, and it's on our website, and we just keep pushing out there, because if we don't, we're gonna get passed over by these kids and they never get in there.
One thing that we're doing on the 24th of October is we have reenactors, the 3rd U.S. Covered Cavalry that's coming into Jackson, Mississippi. This is their 150th year. So what I am zeroing in is on the 9th grade academy. It's 2,400 students in the 9th grade academy, all through every high school here in Jackson, Mississippi. They all have a 9th grade coach. There's a 9th grade principal. So I am zeroing in on those students, and they will be who I work with throughout the year. But with that, if we can get those 2,400 students there, then we have our group. That's the group we're gonna work with.
Let me give you an example of something that we did, or that I did when we were in St. Louis. Is exactly what Dion mentioned. You had to go out and get a grant. And we took the Illinois state standards, the Missouri state standards, and we looked at all of the units, and we developed our curriculum to replace some of the material within that was being taught in the classroom. So you had it exactly as it was. We had the grant, so we also held workshops with teachers to show them exactly how this worked and what you could use and where it would replace this specific component. We took it a little bit further, and I worked directly with the schools, the school district, and had them to select 5 teachers, and actually worked within that classroom and took the curriculum unit, was able to use the grant to get a research assistant to actually go into the classroom and teach this curriculum unit, which was that umbrella I talk about all the time, Through the Eyes of a Child, and this was In the Voice of a Child. And we taught kids how to develop their own oral history project. Now, in addition to those 5 classrooms that we worked with in each year, we also had the curriculum unit that was purchased by the grant. So what I did was I went through every middle school teacher classroom, every middle school that was in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Madison County, Illinois, St. Clair County, Illinois, and I sent them out a curriculum unit. Every last one of them received one. It was a hard copy. It was a hard copy curriculum unit, a DVD, and a documentary video. Every one of them got it, and the grant paid for it, So there are ways to do it. It just takes, number one, it takes money. Everything within the museum is just like anything else. There are 3 pillars: money, time, staff. If you don't have one of those, something is going to falter. If you don't have enough manpower, you know, something, you're trying to, you either need more money, and you need more time. You know, but that's that diamond right there. You got to have the money, the time, and the staff. And if you can get, you know, grant funding and make sure that you get it, make it work, then that's great. But otherwise, you know, you're going to falter.
We have time for about 2 more questions, and we'll call it a night. Yes.
In regards.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to answer that previous question first. I would just note that the STEM, science, technology, engineering, those are also cultural. And there are lots of books on, like, for example, Pompier has a book called Wizards of Science. It looks at Santeria as a science, as an empirical science. So there's lots of literature on that. My question is, going back to, is it Jackie, the first speaker? Yeah, you mentioned, I was thinking about what you said about Ferguson and how the museums can be a space where, as an example, how the Ferguson protesters can be looking at the past and learning lessons. And then my thought was that you're right, I agree with you that there are lessons from the past, important lessons that the youth must learn. But on the other hand, 2014 is not 1964. Things have changed. The movement of today is not exactly the same as the movement of 1964. So in that sense, there is also lessons that the youth can teach the elders about current circumstances. So in that, along those lines of thinking, I'm wondering what, if anything, you learned from young folk, young black folk especially, about what museums might look like, say, in the future, because museums typically look back and except for maybe there was a recent look at black futurism, but typically they look backwards. And so I'm wondering, looking forward to say maybe 2050, if you learn anything from black youth that might help us think differently about what museums might look like in the future.
And I mean, I have to say, there's some truth to everything that you said in terms of, let me start with, yes, the movement today is not the movement of 1964, but many of the same issues are the same today that they were in 1964, and the strategies that were applied in 1964 need to be applied in many respects today. What I was specifically talking about when I was talking about the Ferguson protest was a protest that occurred just last night at Busch Stadium, and the protesters themselves were engaging with the audience. What I was talking about, I mean, just on Saturday, I'm heading down to Miami University, the site where the Freedom Summer workers were trained, is they need to be trained how not to engage the community that they're protesting, you know. Get your information out and make sure that your story is told, but there's no need in engaging that community, those individuals, because all you're going to do is incite it. That's the museums are part of the community, whether they want to be or not, but they are community. They should be community oriented. They should be a safe place where everybody can have a conversation. They should be a safe place where young people and old people can come together. And one of the reasons why I love oral history is because it is intergenerational. And it is a way in which we can have the elderly talking to the younger people, and we can also have that vice versa. Many times we do learn from each other, and there are a lot of things that needs to be shared in terms of what is understood. One of the things we're doing with the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, the last gallery, is we're looking at where are we now and where do we go from here. You know, and that's a changing gallery because it's going to be changing in terms of where are we now. Where we are in 2014 may not be where we are in 2017, you know, as Mississippi, as a culture. There are a lot of things that are changing in regards to how museums tell their story, whether or not they're using a lot of, you know, more interactive components, or whether or not they're using getting the story out through social media, which is something that we're taking advantage of. I know in terms of communicating with people through different social media sites, people are looking at different apps and seeing, you know, the entire gallery at their fingertips. So there are a lot of ways in which the museum is in changing in terms of the technological advantages. The other thing that we're doing this weekend is we're creating an app, or I should say I'm part of the council, the Humanities Council Committee, that with the Miami University that's created an app on how to walk through the Freedom Summer volunteer training session. So that's something that you'll be able to actually access and download within whether you're on site or whether or not you are, you know, 5,000 miles away. So there are different ways in which we can engage the youth. One of the things I did when we were at the, and that I, you know, as Pam talked about, we want to develop exhibitions and projects and programs that the community want, you know. So we had focus groups. And in my focus groups, I had, you know, high school students, I had college students, I had civil rights veterans, I had police officers, I had teachers, I had politicians, I had university professors, bankers that were part of the focus group. And then I formed an advisory commission. And, you know, from those 40-member focus group members, I created a 12-member advisory commission from the community that helped to make sure that I was keeping keeping true to what they had told me in the focus groups. And one of the, you know, well, I had one that was a high school student and one that was a college student that was part of my advisory commission. They stayed with me. Well, they weren't in college and high school by the time we finished because it was an 8-year project. But they stayed with me from the beginning to the end of the project to make sure that everything was done. So, you know.
I mean, I kind of wanted to ask about race relations again, especially in Mississippi because it's different here than anywhere else in the world. And there's still tension between races here. So how, I know you talked a bit about it, but how do you deal with that audience, drawing that audience to your museum, having black people come to the museum just to come, and having white people to come not for a spectacle of history, but for engagement, for change, civil change.
Can I piggyback on that? That was kind of my question in terms of for Dion about the diversity of your staff and in your opinion, would you set as a value kind of that?
I'm going to you first on diversity. I think I spoke on diversity at my last job, how you had to go out and beat the bushes. And what I've told my board, so now we're predominantly black, because now you have a black executive director, now the staff has swayed to black. But we have went everywhere trying to recruit and hire whites. But you have to remember we're in Indianola, and this is what I was told, literally. You don't want to work up there with all those blacks, do you? So if you come and work with us, and you're from the community, I'm not saying it's gonna happen, but with this one individual, then every time they go out to socialize, then they're talking about where they work at. So I don't know if that's what's stopping. You know, every time a position comes up, we want to diversify. It's hard, so I understand it. And as far as the relations go, Indianola is really, I wouldn't be there. I don't have to be there. I've been there coming up on 4 years. The community as a whole gets along great. When you speak about race relations, I see more problems up north than I do in Mississippi, from what I've seen and what I've experienced, because here you know where you stand. There is no question. And there's just as many good blacks as there's whites and vice versa. Up north, you never know what you're dealing with, from my experience. So I really appreciate it. And if I did not, but it's a change, because when I first got here, all I seen was the propaganda we see on TV through movies. But when you come and live it, it's not as bad as what is portrayed as what's up north. There's a story here, and that's what Mississippi has to embrace, is the ugliness of what has happened. But as far, I hear people talking about how far Mississippi has moved on. I don't know, because I wasn't here, and I wouldn't attempt to say I was here, but what I can say, I'm treated with respect, black and white, because I demand it. And That's all. I mean, but even saying that, it's a mentality though in the Delta, you know, and maybe everywhere. I shouldn't just say the Delta. But what I hate is when I hear people say, well, this is what white people think. Or you be in a crowd and this is what black people think. No, that's not the way it is. Just because something happened doesn't mean it's because of the color you are. And so that's what we talk about at work amongst ourselves, educating ourselves. We have heated debates. You go looking for it, you're gonna find it. I hope I answered your question, because I'm telling you, you'll hear, and you're gonna hear it up north too, whether white people are doing this or black people are doing that. You hear about it down in the Delta too, but it's not as bad in the Delta as everybody paint that picture to be.
Let me just talk about what we do at Smith Robertson Museum and Culture Center. One of our biggest things that I say that we do well is telling the story about African Americans in Mississippi. All white group comes in. That's our stage to tell the truth. They may leave out crying, they may apologize, but what we tell them is it's okay, because we want you to understand how we as African Americans feel on a day-to-day basis. I had a group from Jackson Academy. Everybody in the group was probably 16 or 17. It was 50 of them. I got letters from 50 students who were very positive in what they felt about the museum and that they didn't know because nobody told them. If we don't start today telling the whole truth, as I tell people, we can't tell the story in fuchsia, green, and yellow. We have to tell the story in black and white. If we do that, we help Mississippi, we help Jackson, because of course, as Deanna said, they look at us differently. For Smith Robertson, people in Europe know about Smith Robertson. People in Australia know about Smith Robertson. People in Canada come to Smith Robertson and ask us, why do whites act the way they do in the United States? These are the type of questions we get. But our own people don't engage us because they're interested in knowing what happened in Mississippi. They're interested in knowing the history. Mississippi history is big, y'all. But you guys have to learn how to tell the story if you're going to stay in this field. You have to learn how to be passionate. It can come from the heart, but you got to look at them and be able to tell it. I cry sometimes when I tell it, because I give it with feelings. I overwhelm my own self. But it's because I love what I do. So if you're gonna be in this field, you gotta know how to engage. You have to work with the community. You're gonna have to want to stay all night and have programmings that deal with talking about the killings that are going on today. We have an exhibit that we're looking at called Ken Killing Ken. It's awesome. Black on black crime. And the ancillary programming that we'll do around it is gonna be wow. Because if we don't start talking about this stuff, it's gonna continue. But it starts with you.
And just to piggyback on what she said, tell the truth. Don't hold no punches when you tell the truth. If it hurts your feelings, you should have no business asking. I mean, when the very first film you walk in, Dr. Matthews, he's 94 years old, Mr. King's best friend, he still cuts his own grass. But in there, he says, back then, we wouldn't call blacks or Negroes. We called niggas. And to see the white people's face when you see that, they shoot it raw in there. They ain't hold no punches. People come out in tears and said, I had no idea. And one last story, this little 13-year-old girl in Greenwood, Mississippi, it was an article in the paper. Her mother wanted to bring her to the B.B. King Museum. And to make a long story short, this 13-year-old kid said, I had no idea that white people treated blacks so bad. So it's there, it just needs to be taught. It's not for sympathy, but you gotta know where you come from so we don't go back.
And I'll try to be real quick, but Dion mentioned his experience in Mississippi, and you know, we here to tell the truth here. So there is a difference between the North and the South. There are issues that are going on in the North, but there is a difference between the North and the South. There is a significant, and I wouldn't be honest with you if I didn't say that I feel there's a level of Southern hospitality that's at the surface, but when you get deep down, you might know where you're coming from on the surface, but you don't know where you're coming from deep down. So, and we need, one of the things I think that we have been unsuccessful in doing is we have been unsuccessful in getting to the source of the cancer. We keep putting Band-Aids on it. And it doesn't help for us to continue to pretend as if those issues are not there, because obviously they are. Or, we wouldn't have the lowest in terms of a number of factors. When you're talking about unemployment, when you're talking about education, when you're talking about healthcare, when you're talking about weight, when you're talking about all of these indices that are tested throughout the World Health Organization. When you talk about all of these indices, those problems wouldn't still exist within our communities if there wasn't a systematic problem that was going on within this country and within this state as well. So, I'm just saying, let's talk about it, and let's talk about it from its source. There are problems in the North. I've lived North and South. And I know, and I can tell and I can feel the difference. When we were at when I was at the Missouri Historical Society, we were actually, the director told me, the president of the Historical Society told me, Black people will not come into our museum. They will not come into the Missouri History Museum because they're not comfortable with this, the elite structure of this place and the beautification of the building. Like, they had no problem coming when I created exhibits and when I created things that was of interest to them. It's because of the individuals that are running this institution and the personality that you're portraying and the information that you're giving out in terms of whether or not somebody can see themselves within these galleries and whether or not they're part of this gallery. When we were at the DeSalvo Museum, we had one of Dr. Burroughs' poems that was on the wall, which was "What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black?" A very powerful poem, And you had many white people that would walk through and say that was racist. You shouldn't have that up on the wall. It's like, I'm sorry, there are things that you do tell your children that are Black that you don't tell your children that are white. And Dr. Burroughs is just, relaying that within her poetry. So, let's have these conversations. Let's not hold them within and pretend as if we all understand and as if we all agree. My experience is going to be different than your experience. Not only in terms of age, but also in terms of mentality, in terms of cultural, experiences, and in terms of where I've been and where you've been and what you've seen and what I've seen. So, we may not, just because the color of our skin looks alike, we may not always agree on, the main issue. So we need to be able to have these conversations and be able to make sure that at least we understand each other. At least we start with a level of understanding, because I think oftentimes we reach point A or point Z thinking we're all in agreement, and we have not even been talking about the same thing from A to the end. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, we can talk about that. We're going to take this on the road. So, thank you so much for being a part of this forum. We've learned a lot tonight about museums, not only museums, about social issues and how museums affect social issues and social change. So it's been awesome. Words cannot express how I feel, and I'm sure the audience feels the same. We're kind of pumped, we're ready to get out and do something, and not only educate